So, the 2025 housing market. Man, what a ride. By pretty much every measure, it was one of the toughest years we've seen in a long, long time. But hidden deep inside the end-of-year data, there's this surprising twist that tells a completely different and way more optimistic story. So what's the real story here? Let's dive in and unpack this tale of two very different halves.
Okay, I want you to look at this number, 1,000. That's it. Now, in a market where millions of homes are changing hands, what on earth could a number this small possibly signify? Well, as it turns out, it was the tiny little gap between a really tough year and a historically awful one.
That's right, just 1,000 homes. That was the razor-thin margin, the photo finish that officially made 2025 the slowest year for home sales all the way back since 1995. It just barely, and I mean barely, beat out 2024 for that unfortunate title. Talk about a nail-biter, right? It just perfectly sums up the tension we saw in the market.
All right, so first things first, let's really dig into the first half of this story and understand what made 2025 so incredibly tough for so many people out there.
You don't have to take my word for it. Lawrence Yun, the chief economist over at the National Association of Real Estaters, he really put it perfectly. For pretty much the entire year, homebuyers were caught in this brutal squeeze play. On one side, you had prices soaring to record highs, and on the other, the number of homes actually for sale was at historic lows. It was just a brutal landscape for anyone trying to find a place to call home.
But, and this is a big but, that's not where the story ends. Just when everyone was ready to write the year off, the market threw a major curveball. Right at the finish line, we got what I'm calling the December surprise.
And here it is, in black and white. Just look at this. In December, existing home sales didn't just inch up, they jumped 5.1% from the month before. Now that's not just some tiny little blip on the radar, that's a serious surge. It was a real signal that the momentum was starting to shift.
And believe it or not, that jump was even bigger than it looks on the surface. See, economists have this thing called seasonal adjustment, where they account for the fact that, things naturally slow down for the holidays. Once you factor that in, December's sales were actually the strongest we've seen in nearly 3 years. So no, this was not a fluke. It was a really powerful end to a super challenging year.
Now, of course, the housing market is never a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. This recovery, this little boomlet, it didn't look the same everywhere. Down in the South, they actually saw some real gains compared to the year before. The Midwest and the West, they were pretty much holding steady, kind of flat. But the Northeast actually saw a little bit of a decline. It just goes to show you how different things can be from one region to the next.
So this begs the big question, right? What was behind all this? What actually fueled this surprising turnaround at the end of the year? Let's get into the mechanics of it.
Well, according to the experts, it was basically a perfect storm of good news that finally gave homebuyers a little breathing room. So in that last quarter, a couple of huge things happened. First, mortgage rates started to come down. This was a big deal. And at the same time, that crazy, relentless climb in home prices, it finally started to lose some steam. All of this together created this little window of opportunity that buyers jumped on.
Okay, another really important piece of the puzzle is something called housing inventory. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. It's just a measure of how long it would take to sell every single home that's currently on the market. In December, we were looking at a 3.3-month supply, which is still pretty tight. And what happens with inventory next is going to be absolutely critical.
And speaking of inventory, Lawrence Yun, who we heard from earlier, actually has some pretty hopeful news on that front. He's like, yeah, look, things are tight right now. But he's also predicting that we'll see more homes start to hit the market, probably beginning in February. That's a pattern we often see, and if it holds, it could really help ease some of that pressure on buyers.
Okay, so with all the drama of 2025 in the rearview mirror, what does this all mean for the year ahead? Let's shift gears and take a look at the forecast for 2026.
So looking ahead, we've got another expert weighing in. This time it's Danielle Hale, the chief economist at Realtor.com, and she's seeing some real reasons to be optimistic. She's basically saying that incredible strength we saw at the end of 2025, that wasn't just a flash in the pan. She thinks it's the beginning of a much more stable trend.
And her optimism isn't just wishful thinking. It's based on some really solid factors. For one, mortgage rates are hanging out near their lowest levels in about a year, which is a huge help for affordability. But just as important, the bigger economic picture is starting to calm down. We've got steady employment, which means people feel secure enough to make big purchases, and inflation is cooling off, which helps keep those mortgage rates from going wild again.
And I love how Danielle Hale puts it. She says all these things coming together should help put a firmer floor under sales. What does that mean? Well, it suggests we're moving away from the crazy up and down swings of the last few years and heading towards something a lot more stable, which is good news for everyone.
And that, right there, brings us to the big, essential question for the year ahead. After a year that was this close to setting the wrong kind of record, but then ended on such a high note, has the housing market finally found its footing? With interest rates steadying and the economy finding its balance, is this the firm foundation we've all been waiting for? That is the big question, and you can bet everyone is going to be watching closely to see how it plays out in 2026.